even though I've got a fictional town, the book begins by making it clear that I'm talking about Cowra and what happened here on the night of the 4th and 5th. I'm grateful to be here, but I'm nervous about two things, and that is, from the start I thought this has to be fictional because many people are still alive who are my age and didn't want to be in a situation where people came up to me in Cowra and said, you're talking about my great auntie, she didn't have anything to do with an Italian, or you're talking about my great uncle, he wasn't an alcoholic. And so I wanted to have the freedom to tell the Cowra story, but in my own terms. After all, fiction, as I think I say in the introduction, means lies. I've always been living in Sydney, in the suburb of Manly, where all the more highly evolved rugby league players come from. But travelling in New South Wales, I've always stopped here, and I've seen greater and greater interpretation given to the site. And it's extraordinary and unbelievable that 1,000 young Japanese decided to self-immolate on the night of the 4th of August. They voted for it in the afternoon. Early the next morning, they ran to the wire, and a great number of them were killed, and a number of Australians. And then those who survived the run to the wire dispersed into this countryside, and over the next couple of days either suicided or were rounded up. This was something I remember as a 9-year-old. We had an auntie in Mandurama, and there were stories of her sleeping with an axe because her menfolk were away. That made a big impact on me, and it bespoke a feeling we had in New South Wales that these prisoners were after us. It was only after a time that we began to understand that they were trying to make up for, to expiate the fact that they'd been captured, the fact that their memorial services had been held back home in Japan, the fact that the Japanese government did not countenance the surrender of prisoners. Therefore, citizens of the Commonwealth of Australia were specifically excluded as targets in the resolutions taken on the, right here, hard to believe, on the afternoon of August the 4th. I was in Sydney, my father was overseas, and it seemed a very threatening event to us. I was a charming 9-year-old, and I've lost some of that charm with my hair, but the event galvanized us so that even in Sydney and as far away as Wollongong, people saw the escaped prisoners, thought they saw them, and there were reports made to police of prisoners flitting from station to station. They were nowhere near, but the fact that people believed they saw them in Sydney indicates what an impact this outbreak had on the Australian imagination. And of course the fact that it was a crisis for us Australians, because we had treated the prisoners well for a number of reasons. One was humanitarian, because we were signatories of the Geneva Convention and the Japanese were not. Second was that being signatories, we're subject to Red Cross inspection, and inspection by the Swiss Japanese Bureau in Sydney. And then third, we had a further motivation to treat them well, growing out of the fact that they held so many more of our people than we held of theirs. And we were nervous about reprisals. So in my book, I make the commandant of the Japanese compound a man whose son is a prisoner of the Japanese, and who is therefore motivated to ensure that none of them come to harm. And yet on this night, through the charging of the wire, all those over in the cemetery, which direction is over there, all those dead in the cemetery, or most of them, there are some elderly Japanese internees who are in the graves over there too, who were not involved in the rush to the wire. But due to the perception that they had somehow shamed themselves and they must expiate it for the good of their families, that's what drove them. And I found that fascinating and wanted to try to explain it. And then, of course, there was Cowra, like the rest of Australia, white Australia, very uncomprehending of Japanese, the motives that drove the Japanese, of both Japanese culture in its benign form and Japanese culture in its militaristic form, which admittedly was a very sinister form that the culture took at that stage of history. And so, one that they have resiled, the Japanese now look back on with a certain regret, as we do, and hence the beautiful garden over there and the sense of reconciliation that this place now represents. So, having been 9 years old and having felt the reverberations of this event, I've always wanted to write about it. And I was always fascinated by the Italians. They used to go past our place in Homebush because we lived on the railway line, and my mother would sometimes wave to them. I don't know why. My father was away, maybe she shouldn't. But anyhow, I'm sure her intentions were purely grew out of the fact that by then, by the time of this outbreak, the Mussolini had surrendered. There were few fascists left in the compound. Most of them a number of them wanted to fight for the Allies, now that Italy was our ally, but providing shipping for that purpose was impossible. And so they stayed here or on the farms. And that meeting between the Italians and the Australians was a very interesting one that I wanted to examine too. And the range of political opinion that occurred in this camp, where the left-wingers wanted to fight the fascists, and the fascists early in the existence of this camp, the Italian fascists, the pro-Mussolini men, were far more numerous, and they were certainly the most powerful element early in the war here, but they lost their influence as Italy lost the war, as Mussolini was executed, and it was easy to find Italians who had no affection for Mussolini at all and put them on farms round the district. And hence I get my young woman Alice, because if possible you should get a young woman called Alice and a good-looking Italian boy into every novel you write. I hope that's a helpful tip to the high school students who are here. I write an introduction in which I try to excuse myself for giving the novel, or the township in this novel, a fictional name. It's Garwell, Now, I looked up the Wiradjuri language, and the word gawal is taken from Wiradjuri. The problem is, I meant to look up on the internet yesterday precisely what it means, because I've forgotten. But it is a word from Wiradjuri, and the reasons for changing the town are partly explained. For example, the commandant here was the subject of an inquiry. Obviously, terrible mistakes were made here, and obviously terrible mistakes in response to the outbreak were made by the commander of the training battalion. And they were both inquired, part of an inquiry, but we couldn't afford to condemn them too severely for decisions they made about the security of the camp and about the way the young men of the training battalion were going to react. We didn't want to blame them in case the Japanese pointed to it. Indeed, the Japanese declared after the outbreak that the massacred people here were internees. It was a massacre of internees, as depicted in Japanese press releases of the time, and the reason it was a massacre of civilians was that no Japanese prisoner surrendered. It's very interesting that after the war, some were willing to acknowledge their time in Cowra, but others would rather die than do so. They still felt, even post-war, that imprisonment was shameful. A few other remarks. The outbreak of Japanese prisoners from a camp on the edge of the New South Wales central west town of Cowra occurred when I was 9, as I've said. My father was absent serving overseas. Without him to stand on the threshold of our house and repel this outburst, it seemed, even in the suburbs of Sydney, a terrifying business, an invasion from within the heartland. We did not understand its motives, which lay beyond the horizons of our culture and imaginations. We judged them to include the intent to do unspeakable damage to women, children, and men in that order. To thwart such malice, people armed themselves, and that is covered in the book itself. The truth is that I have not created the exact set of events that occurred in Cowra during the outbreak of 5th 1944. I did not want to offend those who lived through that night and the days before and after. And though above all I've tried to read as exactly as I can the cultures of both sides to the calamity, the culture of the town and the garrison and the culture of the Japanese, this novel is not what is called a roman à clef, a novel in which every character is meant to stand for and reflect a real person who was in Cowra then. And yet the outbreak in my book, of course, derives entirely from Cowra, and I'd like to think that my story is a sibling version of the Cowra one, related strongly by DNA, and the same in many regards, but in others bearing different names and features. For example, the full moon plays its part in the Gowral outbreak as it did in that of Cowra. The climactic night was one of fierce cold in the case of both the real outbreak and the fictional one in my book. Yet the heroine, Alice Herman, is a creation and did not exist outside this narrative's limits. And yet there were young women like her whom I knew at that time. And the same that provisos I lay on Alice can be laid on the Italian prisoner Giancarlo Molisano. There was a novelist out here at this camp called E.V. Timms. He was the major in charge of one of the compounds here. He was a very popular novelist of his time. He wrote historical fiction, and I've replaced him in my book with the fictional Major Sutter, who actually writes late at night in Cara morale-boosting radio serials of the kinds we used to listen to during the war. And as well as that, he commands the Japanese compound. He's not meant to reflect E.V. Timms's life, actions, motions, or preoccupations. And nor is my commandant, Colonel Abacare, crafted to reproduce the character and events of the actual commandant's life. There was a Korean informer in both the book and in this camp, but he was not the Cheong of my account. There was a Japanese prisoner who sought to warn the garrison and thus saved many lives, but he was not the same man quite as the man named Ban, B-A-N, in the tale as I tell it here. That Japanese informer probably saved many lives, ironically both Japanese and certainly Australian, because his act brought the outbreak forward by an hour and gave an extra layer of warning to the garrison. I hope there's truth in this fiction, in its imagining of motives and in the actions of these characters, that they do represent in feeling what happened in that time. But again, this is fiction. These sorts of disclaimers often accompany novels, and the novelist can be fairly accused of claiming the best of both worlds. That is, thank you, Cara, I took your story, but look, I've done what I wanted with it. The best of both worlds. But I hope the readers of this novel, and I hope it is read for some time in Cara to come, and there'll be people who criticize it, but that's the stuff of novels. I hope the readers of this novel feel they are getting the best of both worlds too. For whatever the liberties that have been taken, what happened in Cara is a great story. The story of what happened close to this town here in August 1944, a township far from the battlefield and from the main discourse of the earth. So I'm very grateful to come here to a site where peace is the theme. I try to prefigure what will happen to the Australian-Japanese relationship after the war ends. For example, white Australia was broken down, I suppose one of the a notable dent in its skin were the Japanese brides that Australian troops married and brought back to Australia in the 1950s. And then in the time of Menzies, late 50s, early 60s, Percy Spender began to forge a particular trading and diplomatic relationship with Japan. And that relationship has been strong ever since. And it's particularly strong in Australia now, and it's particularly strong, I know, in Cara, because isn't it the truth that some of these kids exchange with Japanese schools and vice versa? So it's interesting where history brings you. If you live long enough, yesterday's enemy becomes your firmest friend. I'd just like to pay tribute as well as to the Japanese man who blew the whistle, to the crazy courage of the Japanese who fell here, the ill-advised, in according to our culture, courage of that, and to the courage of the machine gunner who threw the machine gun block away as he was approached by, as he was overrun and killed by the advancing tide of prisoners, and who thus again saved a tremendous number of lives, for that gun would have been turned upon the garrison. A great shock for us, because the Japanese held 25,000 of ours and we held a few thousand of theirs. We didn't want reprisals, and that is part of the book too. It's part of the story of Kara, and it's part of the story of the book. But the age of reprisals between Japan and Australia is over, and now you've got the age of mutual sign of a pledge of peace. That is a good thing, but of course it's hard to forget what happened in this compound. Mr. Mayor, thank you again for having us to this, what to almost say a sacred site, an encapsulation of the tragedy of the Pacific War.